With big business on the rise, the common man implored the federal government for protection. In response, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was passed. The act demanded that railroad corporations end the practice of providing rebates for large businesses. Perhaps most significantly, the Interstate Commerce Commission was created under this new bill. The regulatory agency keeps large corporations compliant with anti-monopolization policies to this day. Similarly, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was created in order to regulate trusts. Simply put, the purpose of the bill was to break down monopolies in order to keep competition. However, the loose wording of the document made it difficult to enforce. Despite attempts by the federal government to limit the capabilities of corporations to create monopolies, U.S. administration ultimately failed to regulate safety in both living quarters and factories. Fire and emergency exits were unregulated, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of workers due to voluntary ignorance. At times, the federal administration actively supported immoral business practices as a reaction to the monetary power of large corporations, such as the case of the Pullman strike of 1894. The Pullman Company was a common example of slavery in the modern age. President Cleveland sent the U.S. militia to break down the strike.
The Gilded Age was a period of immense graft and corruption, a theme that would be a mainstay of journalistic reporting throughout the era. Newspapers would play a crucial role in exposing scandals and investigating the wrongdoing of public officials. By the 1870s, Thomas Nast focused his efforts on political cartoons. He led a crusade of corruption, using his images to help remove William Meeker Boss Tweed and his peers from power. The leading advocate of the social gospel movement in the United States was Washington Gladden. Gladden encouraged his congregants to play an active role in community life by attacking immorality in their fellow citizens and government officials. The social gospel movement was a religious movement that arose during the second half of the 19th century. The purpose of wealth was not to hoard it, but to share it with others, such as less fortunate people. One of their most important contributions to society was the creation of settlement houses. Settlement houses provided numerous opportunities for the less fortunate people, including access to education, free or low-cost health care, free or low-cost housing, and innumerable other benefits.
With the onset of hard economic times in the 1870s, other immigrants and European Americans began to compete for the jobs traditionally reserved for the Chinese. With economic competition came dislike and even racial suspicion and hatred. Such feelings were accompanied by the anti-Chinese riots and pressure, especially in California, for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants from the United States. The result of this pressure was the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed by Congress in 1882. This act virtually ended the Chinese immigration for nearly a century.
Workers tried to work together for increasing their wages and giving women the same opportunities as men in the workplace. The Knights of Labor were among the first national labor organization and sought to replace capitalism with the cooperative system, which is where workers take control of the economy. Next, the American Federation of Labor was created. It excluded unskilled or semi-skilled workers from more political and economic power. The strikes' demands typically were partially or fully met, despite losing half of their cases. The International Ladies' Garment Union branched from the AFL. In New York, manufacturers created runway shops to hire non-unionized workers, but the ILGWU created the Cotton Garment and Miscellaneous Trade Department to organize those places and acquire new recruits. In 1965, the Masters Agreement Department was created to create just one contract for all shops by one company, rather than several contracts for multiple. They created the Protocol of Peace, which improved conditions, raised wages, and reduced hours.
Because big businesses' presence increased through the industrial age, the big business owners fought to protect their companies through the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, and the active labor movements. The key entrepreneurs being John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan. Although the government's effort to stop big businesses from not monopolizing, the wording in the Sherman Antitrust Act did the opposite effect and halted labor movements. As stated in the Sherman Act, no restraints of commerce across state lines, which included boycotts and strikes. Likewise, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, that was against the railroad rate discrimination, had little effect, despite the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC could not directly tell railroad companies they are in the wrong, but instead had to file a lawsuit. This is ineffective because the big companies are right behind the government and can easily influence them to let the lawsuits slide by. Then the labor movement was halted when the government declared it illegal. Along with this, the workers would receive hostility from their boss if they try to join, as well as most workers would rather talk personally with employers than join a labor union.
The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed by Congress to prohibit trust. This act was named after Senator John Sherman of Ohio.